Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. If Israel's war has gone way beyond self-defense to the point of making the Gaza Strip itself completely unlivable, why is the Biden administration supporting it? Let's get to the bottom line. In less than 3 months, Israel has killed nearly 1% of the Palestinian people living in the Gaza Strip. To put that in perspective, 1% of the population of America would be more than 3 million people. That's like wiping out an entire state, like Arkansas or Nevada. And so far, there's just no end in sight. Hundreds of innocent civilians, mostly women and children, are killed by Israeli forces daily, and almost 100% of the people living there are now displaced. That's 100%. They're desperate, they're hungry, they're cold. Israeli and U.S. officials are acting as if the Palestinians should blame themselves because Hamas carried out a surprise attack in October that killed about 1,200 Israeli soldiers and civilians. But when a country wages a war, it usually has a specific outcome that it's looking for. So what's the end game for Israel? Today we're talking with one of America's most influential thinkers, John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and author of The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, as well as, most recently, How States Think, the Rationality of Foreign Policy. John, it's terrific to be with you today. Thank you so much for joining us. You wrote a piece this week, Death and Destruction in Gaza, in which you said that we've reached a point where there is simply no meaningful military purpose in Israel's war. Tell us what you meant.
Well, when it comes to what Israel is doing in Gaza, you have to distinguish between going after Hamas and punishing the civilian population. And when we talk about punishing the civilian population, we're talking about killing, murdering huge numbers of civilians, displacing them from their home, starving large chunks of the Palestinian population inside Gaza, and so forth and so on. These are basically war crimes. I don't think there are many people who would dispute that Israel has what we call the right to go after Hamas. Hamas attacked Israel. Israel's going after Hamas. That's not really a contested issue for the most part. But what the Israelis are doing is they're going far beyond going after Hamas, and they are inflicting massive pain and punishment on the civilian population. And in my opinion, this should be unacceptable to decent people all over the world. And the idea that the Biden administration is not only sanctioning this, but supporting it. It's very important to understand that the Israelis could not conduct this punishment campaign without support from the United States. They need American military weaponry, and furthermore, they need American diplomatic support. And we are giving that to them. So we are as deeply involved in this disaster, this humanitarian disaster, as the Israelis themselves are.
Do you find that there's a worry that America's on the wrong side of this?
No, I think there's widespread support inside the American body politic for the Palestinian civilian population. I mean, I don't think there's any question that lots of people think that what the Israelis are doing to the civilian population is deeply wrong. There's no question there. A lot of people won't voice their opinion on this issue publicly, and that's in large part because they fear that the Israel lobby will target them and that will do damage to their career. There's all sorts of evidence that people on college and university campuses are self-censoring for fear of the Israel lobby. But even there, it's clear that there's just widespread support for the Palestinian people and widespread criticism of what Israel's doing.
What would you be advising President Biden early on in this conflict if you were trying to advise him or the Israelis how to respond after October 7th?
Well, I think in the beginning, Biden should have gone to great lengths to tell the Israelis to make sure that they executed a measured response and that they did not overreact. And he should have made it clear that he would support the Israelis against Hamas I mean, he had no choice there for sure, but he also should have made it clear to the Israelis that if they went after the civilian population the way they are going after the civilian population, the United States would go to great lengths to throttle Israel's attempts to murder huge numbers of civilians. That's what he should have done. We should be on the other side of the divide with regard to this campaign, this bombing campaign that the Israelis are waging against the Palestinian civilians. And by the way, it's not just a bombing campaign. The Israelis are trying to starve large numbers of Palestinians to death. They've made that very clear. It's not like I'm making this up. The Israelis themselves say that this is exactly what they're doing. If you look at what the Israelis are saying about the Palestinians, how they describe the Palestinians, talking about them as human animals and so forth and so on, and then you listen to what they're saying when they talk about what they intend to do to Gaza. You know, they talk about flattening, leveling it, eradicating it. You see very clearly that they are purposely targeting the civilian population, and they are doing massive amounts of killing.
John, if killing 1% of the population, so many innocent people, isn't a red line for the neighborhood, for Egypt, for Jordan, for other nations around there, for the United States, are we all just in a performance act right now saying, Israel, please don't harm civilians, please limit what you're doing, but we're just helpless and just watching a horrible scene just unfold with no real leverage?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. I mean, just to talk about the United States, we have the potential to bring this bombing campaign to an end. We have huge potential leverage over Israel. There's no question about it. But it's almost impossible for any president, including President Biden, obviously, to use any of that leverage. And the end result is we can say that we hope Israel will limit this campaign and do everything it can to minimize civilian casualties, but we don't do anything concrete, or at least we haven't done anything concrete up to this point to prevent the Israelis from killing large numbers of civilians. And by the way, it's not just the Americans. The Europeans are doing nothing themselves. The Germans and the British, their behavior is especially egregious on this front. But even in the Arab world, you don't see the elites in the Arab world doing very much to put an end to this. And in fact, there's all sorts of evidence that in the Arab world, it's pressure from below that is largely motivating the elites to criticize what the Israelis are doing. And it's a tragic situation. And it is quite remarkable in the year 2023 that the Israelis are able to get away with this.
What do you think Israel wants, if not a two-state solution?
Oh, it's very clear to me what Israel wants. And we're talking here about the government. They want to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and they want to ethnically cleanse the West Bank. The problem that the Israelis face, Steve, is that inside Greater Israel, and Greater Israel includes Gaza, the West Bank, and Green Line Israel, there are approximately 7.3 million Palestinians, and there are approximately 7.3 million Jews. So you have rough equality in the number of Jews and Palestinians inside Greater Israel. And that means you can't have a democratic state. And if you don't want a two-state solution, then what are you going to do? Well, up to now, the answer is quite clear. Israel has turned into an apartheid state. It is an apartheid state. And the Israelis understand that over the long term, this is probably not viable. We all know what happened to South Africa. Can Israel exist over the long term as an apartheid state? And you want to remember that groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and so forth and so on have labeled Israel as an apartheid state. So they want to get out of that situation. And the best way to do that, from their point of view, is to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, much like they ethnically cleansed large parts of Green Line Israel in 1948, and much the way they cleansed large parts of the West Bank in 1967. The problem is that they have not been able to do that. And the United States, much to its credit, has at least said that it will not countenance Israel ethnically cleansing Gaza. But we'll see what happens there. The Israelis are punishing the civilian population in Gaza, in large part, in my opinion, to drive them out. But they have not been successful so far.
I want to play for you, John, a clip of Danny Danon, Israel's former ambassador to the United Nations in 2019, and something he said about what's behind Israel's goals. Listen.
This is a deed to our land.
He's holding up the Bible, basically the Old Testament, to say this is the deed to our lands in the United Nations. And I'm just asking you, as sort of an analyst, to say, if that's what we're working with, and America is allied with that, how does this ever get to a different point than just an ongoing, horrible, convulsive ulcer?
It doesn't. I mean, this is where we are. And by the way, if you look at the demographics inside of Israel, the people who are most likely to make the argument that was just made, that, you know, the Bible is Israel's deed to owning all of Greater Israel, the people who are most likely to make that argument are the ultra-Orthodox. And the ultra-Orthodox now form about 13% of Israel's population. But over time, their numbers are going to increase greatly, up to the point where in about the year 2050, you're going to have about 30% of Israel, close to 1/3 of Israel will be ultra-Orthodox. And that's because the birth rate among ultra-Orthodox women is so high. This means that the argument that Danny Danon was just making is going to become heard more widely in Israel. It's not only going to be people like him, it's going to be more and more ultra-Orthodox Jews making that argument. So this argument's simply not going away.
Let me ask you about responsibility to protect, because right now in Washington, we have a couple of things tied together. American support of Ukraine in the Russia war, a lot of, particularly those on the progressive side of the foreign policy, we're talking about R2P, the responsibility to protect, as one of the animators of American support Ukraine. Where are they with regards to the Israel-Gaza conflict and the responsibility to protect Palestinians?
I hear remarkably little from them. There are all these people who have been talking for years now about the importance of R2P, the importance of protecting human rights. And you would expect all of them to be loudly proclaiming that what the Israelis are doing is unacceptable and that the United States has a moral responsibility to put an end to all of this killing of civilians, of Palestinians. But you hear very little from these human rights proponents and from human rights groups inside the United States. The silence is actually quite amazing.
You know, when I watch polls and what's going on, it's very clear that younger generation Democrats, particularly Democrats of color, but it's really broad swath of younger voters in the Democratic Party, are very, very frustrated with Joe Biden's position on Israel-Gaza. And you see a collapse in their support. And when you interview them and do focus groups right now, they say there's nothing that's going to bring them to support Joe Biden.
There's a more general problem at play here, and that is that Israel has lots of support among people your age and my age. But once you begin to go down and look at younger cohorts, it's a very different story. There's a Harris-Harvard poll that came out very recently that says that if you look at people between the ages of 18 and 24, you survey them, and you ask them this question: Was Hamas justified in killing Israeli citizens on October 7th? We're not talking about killing the military. We're talking about killing civilians. In other words, was Hamas justified in what it did on October 7th? 51% of people in the United States between the ages of 18 and 24 say that Hamas was justified. This is stunning. And then if you look at people between the ages of 25 and 34, 48% say that Hamas was justified in what it did on October 7th. So you see that Israel has a real problem. And of course, this problem manifests itself on college campuses. And that's why the lobby is working overtime now to try to shut down criticism of Israel at universities and colleges.
In his last interview, Henry Kissinger did with Axel Springer CEO Matthias Döpfner, Kissinger said that the problem societies like the United States and Germany had was letting in so many refugees, so many people from other groups, because they then become agents for those other groups, for those other identities. And it just seemed to me one of the most remarkable, inhumane comments about the importance of others outside, like Palestinians. You know, I'm interested in that tension about race and identity inside pluralistic societies right now, and whether or not we're trying to wrestle that decency out of ourselves.
Well, I would come at this from a slightly different perspective. I don't like the Kissinger argument about bringing people from different ethnic backgrounds or different countries into the United States. The United States is an immigrant culture. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I have no problem with bringing immigrants into the United States. I think it's what's made bringing immigrants into the United States in huge numbers in the 19th century is what made this country great, and it's what will keep this country powerful into the future. So I have no problem with immigration. The issue for me is how to think about realist behavior versus moral behavior when you think about how a state should act in the international system. And I fully understand that states have a deep-seated interest in security competition for the purposes of maximizing their chances of surviving. And I fully understand that states sometimes do ruthless things to other states for good strategic reasons, okay? But at the same time, there has to be a moral dimension that underpins how states behave towards other states. And as long as there are no sort of strategic reasons or realist reasons for behaving ruthlessly, states should go to great lengths to act in a moral way. I have no problem making that argument. And I think in the case of what's going on inside of Gaza, there is no strategic reason for Israel to destroy Palestinian society, to kill huge numbers of civilians. It just doesn't make good strategic sense. And I believe it is morally wrong. So this is why I am so deeply opposed to it. I think there's no question that Israel has the right, I use that word loosely, it has the right to go after Hamas. Hamas attacked Israel. Israel can go after Hamas. And I understand that as Israel goes after Hamas, there's going to be collateral damage. Civilians are going to be killed. This happens in wartime. It is regrettable, but it is a basic fact of life. But it's very different than purposely targeting civilians for the purposes of inflicting massive pain and punishment on them. And again, this has no strategic logic. There's no sort of realist reason for doing this. And therefore, I think it's deeply wrong.
Do you see any chance at all America will, in any time, close to now, turn off that tap?
It's a rare occasion when the United States puts coercive leverage on Israel, especially when it comes to dealing with the Palestinians. And that's because any government, including the Biden administration, understands full well that if we are to get rough with the Israelis, or we were to get rough with the Israelis, the Israel lobby would come after the administration hammer and tong. And the administration doesn't want that, especially since we're moving into an election year.
Are we going to be complicit, do you think, in the possibility of equations that are, in fact, ethnic cleansing?
Well, there's not a growing clamor. I mean, there's no question that this is a powerful motive on the right inside of Israel and inside of the United States. The United States has made it clear, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, has made it clear that that's unacceptable. The question is, what happens if the Israelis just do it? One could argue that, we're marching towards the point where there may be massive ethnic cleansing. If this bombing continues and the Israelis continue to prevent water and food and medicine from coming into Gaza in large enough amounts, it could be that the Palestinians begin to move out of Gaza, and that the Israelis do everything they can to facilitate that. Just hard to say how this plays out moving forward. But the Israelis could just do it and just ignore what the Biden administration is saying about what is it and is not acceptable. So it remains a real possibility. And as I said to you before, you want to understand that the Israelis basically have two choices here: whether to continue operating as an apartheid state and to continue keeping Gaza as basically a giant open air prison, or to ethnically cleanse Gaza and the West Bank at the same time, if they can. Now, they would definitely prefer to do that. And the administration has said you can't do that. But again, how that plays itself out remains to be seen.
Well, the Biden administration keeps trying to say that it wants the ground war to end by year's end. I don't see that happening. I see this as a story we're going to be having to continue to focus on for some time. John, I hope you'll come back and keep sharing your perspectives as this evolves. Thank you so much for joining us. Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago.
Thank you, Steve, for having me on the show.
So what's the bottom line? Israel's forces have destroyed more than 100,000 buildings in Gaza. That's on top of the killing of thousands of women and children, innocents, and it implies a different objective in this war. According to at least one Israeli cabinet official, the emphasis is on quote-unquote damage, not accuracy. This conflict, the babies buried in the rubble of collapsed apartment buildings, the destruction of bakeries that provide bread, the parading of captured Palestinian men in underwear, all of it is going to be seared into the minds of not only Palestinian victims, but all of us. There's no moral high ground here. There's no sense that innocent Palestinian people matter in any equation. They were a burden and a nuisance in the eyes of many in Israel, particularly settlers, before October 7th. They're looked at as inhuman. The U.S. government is complicit in the horrors we are seeing. It's just nonsensical. It's an Orwellian circle where America thinks it can both be seen as a legitimate ally of Palestine's interests while it sits coldly on the side of Israel's untempered war machine that only cares about damage. And that's, sadly, the bottom line.